I would like to open the discussion among us and possibly open it to the wider floor with three, well, questions or remarks from my side concerning the three presentations. When Hanoch Gutfreund presented the friends of the Hebrew University in the high days of the Weimar Republic. 1926 was one of the best years of the Weimar Republic. It was after the Locarno Treaty, and Germany in the year of 1926 became a full member of the League of Nations. It's a wonderful year in Weimar history. And what came up to my mind when Hanoch Gutfreund was presenting that very year in the activities promoted by friends of the Hebrew University, what came up to my mind was one institution of mainly non-Jewish persons and personalities, which was very much involved in issues which were related to the Hebrew University, but not defined as promoting the Hebrew University. I'm speaking about the so-called Pro-Palestina Committee. And there were very illustrious persons and personalities, just mentioning one who played a very important role after the year of 1945, which was Konrad Adenauer. So there is some kind of continuities concerning the interwar period, concerning Jewish or, Zionist Hebrew institutions, especially the Hebrew University. And it might be a very interesting focus of research concerning the continuities, the personal continuities, from the Weimar Republic to the post-45 or post-49 years. So, there's a lot of history. It's not just a reinvention, but there is some history. Second, concerning the presentation of Rivka Feldreich, concerning Richard Koebner, who is a very, very important figure in history and historiography. And it's, less a question than possibly a remark concerning the changes you had in mind concerning, let's say, the epistemological turn that happened by, moving from one cultural sphere to another. Concerning Koebner, one has to relate to something like, I would put it like that, an academic or scientific tragedy. Because Koebner was a medievalist in Germany, at Breslau. And a medievalist needs his sources. He was completely, severed from his sources. He had no access to the sources anymore. And I remember when Reinhard Koselleck was once invited in, I think it was in the mid-90s, to Tel Aviv University to give a talk about, his concepts or history of concepts. He opened his talk, obviously, with Richard Koebner, but he didn't mention something which might be of an importance, that the book of the medievalist Richard Koebner about the city history of medieval Cologne was heavily criticized by the father of Reinhard Koselleck, who was an important medievalist. So there's a lot of history behind, let's say, the persons and personalities, but I don't want to go, I just wanted to mention the unbelievable importance of the transformation that took place, Richard Koebner leaving Germany, leaving his field of research, and coming to Palestine and reinventing himself. Reinventing, which doesn't mean that he didn't deal with the history of semantics, words, and concept even before, but that has to be taken into consideration. And there was some irony even in his writings, in his wonderful book about, the history of imperialism, the history of political work, when he defined it with more than a lot of irony, when he said, imperialism has a Jewish face and speaks in English tongue, which really impressed me very much, to define such a phenomenon in one sentence. So Richard Koebner as an example of those transformations, and the tragedy continued because he didn't stay in the country and he moved to England. So, and the last remark concerning Mitchell's presentation. Very much, well, eye-opener concerning that very unique country, state, Austria, and to perceive it from, let's say, from Jewish, Israeli, Jerusalemite perspective and point of view, because Austria makes it much more clear than the concentration on Germany that dealing with the impact of German knowledge here at the Hebrew University, one might be obliged to open up the definition that, let's say, the presence of that kind of culture and its impact, that it might be opened up in the sense that we are talking about German language cultures and less German cultures. German language culture, which means we have to include the culture of Prague and so on and so far, of the Bukovina, which makes it much more, I would not only interesting, but I would even put it like that, it's much more true, yeah, concerning the subjects we are dealing with. And the last word, and then I would like to open the discussion, open up the discussion with a question. The term of successor states. Well, it was, well, ironically intended, because everybody knows that Western Germany, the Federal Republic, and the former GDR in Austria were successor states of the German Reich. And by, well, relating to Israel, it's problematic, very much problematic. However, I just want to mention the subject that I dealt with in the last years quite extensively, which is the reparation agreement of 1952, that by looking into the papers, especially of the German side, it became obvious that they were discussing that issues not from a perspective of reparation or so-called Wiedergutmachung, but from the perspective of the integrations of refugees in the new established state of Israel. And the whole discussion in Wassenaar was a discussion about how much money, well, one have to invest in order to integrate a refugee coming from Europe to the state of Israel. And they agreed about $6,000. Then, why do I mention that? The agreement was signed at September 10th, 1952, in the city of Luxembourg. A week before, the West German Parliament passed a law, but in German language it's the Lastenausgleichsgesetz, or to use the legal German term, which is a really German word, Kriegsfolgenbereinigungsgesetz. That law, which was extremely important for, well, the more, let's say, just division of burdens in German society, something like, I would put it like that, as a social revolution somehow, that the so-called Wiedergutmachungsabkommen was part and parcel of that, well, development, and has to be reflected on that level as well, not only concerning, let's say, questions of moral and other means concerning German-Israeli relation. And so far, that Israeli existence at the very beginning was very much related to, let's say, the German development, not only Germany, but Austria as well, and Israel. So that would be my very short comment to the three presentation. And now I have a question, and I hope that I'm going to hit the point. And it might be a very provocative question, but it's a question that everybody asked himself or herself, what is the nature of German-Israeli scientific relations? Is it science, pure interest in science and research? Is it politics? Is it both? Is it part and parcel of memory as capital? Or is it still restitution? I think it's all of it, but I think that has to be properly discussed. First, our panelists, if possible, and then I would like to open up. Is it okay for the organizers? Yeah, okay. So, please, Hannah.
Yeah, first I would like to make a preliminary remark about your remarks and also about what I heard from my colleagues here, because both lectures refer to the humanities, and Mitchell Ash talks specifically about the role of humanities in the political Israeli-Austrian context, and the whole conference is about humanities. Now, in what I presented, humanities were not mentioned, and they were not there. And that may be another question. Why is it that in the pre-war period, where particularly humanities, the science of Judentum, archaeology, all that was so well represented in German academia, there is no sign of it in the activity of the Friends of the Hebrew University, but there is very deep intellectual discussion about social sciences. I mentioned it briefly. There is a whole memorandum written by Richard, what's his name? It will come back to me. Richard Schmidt from the Politische Auslandskunde in Leipzig about whether political science is a science, whether it is that and that and that. So that's not there. In the post-war period also, science plays, and I will get to your question in a minute, science plays a very important role in the formative years of Israel-German political relations, science, but again, not humanities. And there may be one reason for that, may be that Weizmann Institute was involved, and it is physics, and science also. There are certain restrictions because the main players are nuclear scientists and nuclear physicists, and nuclear physics generated in those days very strong, reservations, and the question is how to cope with that. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Germany very much wanted humanities to be involved. Our scholars in humanities were still not ready for that. And that's the question. Now, to your question, to your specific question, I mentioned this work that on which I'm now, the project that I'm now working on with Jürgen Renn and writing, and our main thesis is that there is in the history of the relations, scientific relations, and now I mean in the broader sense, there are two periods and there is a transition point. Not a very sharp transition point, but there is a process that leads to it and changes the whole mode of cooperation. And the first one we call science for diplomacy, the second one we call science for science. So to elaborate on that would answer your specific questions, but I just gave a headline so that the others can speak also.
Thank you. Rivka, would you like to?
Well, I want to refer to your remark, very important remark about the need to, Koebner's tragic need, in a sense, to reinvent himself from a medievalist to, somebody who does history but also reflects on history, and a lot of these writings are related to this reflection. And this is exactly my point. I would say, let alone the tragic side of the particular case. But I'm speaking about not only a researcher or a scholar, anybody, but in particular scholars, and in particular in the humanities. What does it mean to migrate, without the tragedy, let alone for a moment, okay? To migrate, to make this transition means that you have to, or most migrants use their knowledge as a resource in order to reposition themselves in the new place. And that's exactly what we are witnessing here. And I wanted to go beyond the particular individualistic case and to say something more general about migration of knowledge. And that's, this is exactly the point, crossing the boundaries at the gate of Zion, willingly or unwillingly. The subject is, using his knowledge to transform, in a sense, the identity now. And there is a very interesting intersection between the identity and knowledge itself. And it's an important point, but in the case of Koebner, I didn't see so much a reinvention of identity. No, what I saw is the clear critical voice that, and I have many other examples taken from his articles to Haaretz, for example, after the murder of Lord Moyen. He writes, this is a horrible crime, and political murder is a crime. It could have been written today. So I really wanted to put my hand on this one point about his critical voice. It existed, the book on the Historisches Ganze was finished in 1933, and it was a book of reflection on history and historiography and the meaning of doing history. So in my reading, it did not have to take a tragedy for him to be a medievalist, but to think about history as a whole. And the fact that you cannot just be, one subject person, and that's the point of my lecture.
Okay. Mitch?
Thank you. Just a brief point about the successor states issue. I take your point that it's putting Israel in this box is maybe tricky, and we should have a long discussion about it, but perhaps not now. Austria is relevant, however, because it's absolutely central, it seems to me. I'm thinking about successor state status now as something assigned by a historian to historical actors, not as a legal status accepted or rejected by the participants at the time. But exactly the tension between the two is the relevant issue. The Austrians refused to accept this status of a successor state, but the point that's relevant is they did so with the encouragement of the Allies. One of the few things the Allies who occupied Austria agreed on was the separation of Austria from Germany, both culturally, politically, and every other respect. So they supported, by taking that political move, provided the foundation, preconditions for the Austrian decision to do what it did afterwards. This is often not mentioned in these discussions, and it seems to be important to remember. But these points only come out when you look at them in this broader perspective, in this comparative perspective, and see the differences. You can only see them when you compare. It seems to me it's relevant as a methodological issue as well. And I certainly agree with your point about opening up beyond simply Austria and Germany and thinking about German language cultures as the relevant framework for looking at this. As to your larger question, science, politics, memory as cultural capital, or continuation of restitution. In the Austrian case, it doesn't work at all until after the Waldheim affair to even ask this question, but afterwards it does become a serious question. There have been restitution policies that have been instituted also. I didn't mention them in my discussion, but there have been. Austria has a restitution law for artworks, which the Federal Republic has yet to enact. Unfortunately, it only refers to artworks that are the property of the state. So this film you might have heard about, The Golden Lady, was about an artwork that was in private hands and therefore doesn't really fit the restitution law. But that's a separate issue. My point is that you are certainly right to raise all of these issues. And my emphasis is to think of it as an interactionist perspective between scholarship, in this case, and politics. Cui bono is not meant as a question that has a single answer. You can have multiple answers.
Okay. Yes, I would like to open the floor.
Yeah, Dan, with your last question, you exactly started my lecture tomorrow, because that's my topic. But briefly, I agree somehow with Professor Gutfreund with the two periods, though I must say the science collaboration was not initiated by nuclear physicists, but by a chemist. And he had very material reasons, like Koebner might have had, because Israeli chemical industry was not well developed, and he was looking for contacts. So that was, let's say, the very basic, down to earth. But basically, it was a very much on the German side political, diplomatic endeavor to get internationally accepted again. And on the Israeli side, this material things were in the fore, but later on it developed into science relation, to a real collaboration. So, but that's only to this point. I found, Professor Gutmann, I found very interesting that you said the revival of the Friends of the Hebrew University after the war was not a real revival, because it was very different, a very different story. I tend to agree with that. I have not studied this one, but from what I have studied in the science relationship, and notwithstanding done with the existence of continuities, of course. No, but basically it was a different story. And I was surprised to hear, or maybe also not surprised, that there was an enthusiasm in Germany in the 1950s to create collaboration with Israel. Or no, it was the German friends, the Hebrew of the university. And I wonder what was the motives behind this enthusiasm in Germany. And I have another question for Rivka. Okay, I am not a historian of early modernist times, but what exactly is the meaning of the historical whole as a methodological tool to study the relationships between Israel and Germany after the war?
It's I was trying to refer to one case study and say, look what happens when people migrate, and not relating to the tragedy in particular or anything like that. What happens to knowledge on the move? And I was trying to say that on the one hand, there is here a legacy of the Geisteswissenschaften, no doubt. But on the other hand, when in Germany, in this particular case, and maybe not only in this case, the critical voice was somehow hesitant, not really strong. After migration, within the Israeli context, and I have another part of this lecture on what happens in the Hebrew University, what does it mean to be a university without a state, in a sense, okay? Then things happen. And in this case, the legacy changed, and it changed in the sense that I think the legacy is the constitution of a very strong critical voice that then went to, now I have to say something personal. I was the assistant of Yaakov Talmon, Professor Talmon, who was a student of Koebner. So, my acquaintance with this is a kind of half familiar. And I know that this tradition, this critical tradition that comes from the depths of a perception of the Geisteswissenschaften. What does it mean? I'm not saying this was the perception of everybody in Germany, not at all, but I'm speaking about this particular person. The way he saw these kind of sciences was in epistemic and normative terms. And this really was strengthened after migration. That's my point.
Yes. Edward? The micro?
Before we say the professor, Edward thinks that is the last surviving student.
Yes, probably
Here's the micro. The micro is coming.
survivors who studied with Professor Koebner quite closely for several years. And another reason that I dare talk is that I was a member of the team that wrote the history of the Hebrew University. And I therefore greatly valued your contribution. Well, my comments are about Koebner and his transition to Palestine. And I've really, I think, 3 comments to make. One is that, like many immigrants from Germany to Palestine, who found it very difficult to come to this Asian place, and where the Jewish community was on top of it, ruled by the Ostjuden, it was very difficult for them, but they found solace in the fact that the British were the actual rulers, and they found it easy to transfer their loyalties, their patriotism, from being good Germans to being good British citizens. And Koebner came here without any Hebrew and without any Zionism. This should be admitted, and with that sort of attitude to the government. But in time, and here I want to stress this, in time he became, in the first place, he learned Hebrew. He made a huge effort to learn Hebrew very quickly, and he mastered it. He really mastered it. This is one thing. The second thing is that he grew very fond of his Israeli students and constantly praised their open-mindedness and everything else about it. So that he did change, but he changed to become more in favor of what he saw here. And he was critical of certain things, as you mentioned, but he was also he also became very critical of the British government. And in my work for my work on the history of the Hebrew University, which I called Politics on Mount Scopus, I read in the archives a great many letters by Koebner to the British government, to the Bishop of Jerusalem, in which he openly accused the British of dividing and ruling. He said that instead of working for the Jews and Arabs to cooperate, they were intentionally splitting them. This was, in that sense, he was critical, but not just against the Zionist policy. Another point that I wanted to make is that about the transition from medieval history to modern history. He actually founded the history department at the university, and it was supposed to be a general history department, but it was criticized by many for becoming almost a British history department, because, and that is because of the sources problem that you raised. Because he didn't have any other sources, the only sources he could have access to were British sources. He became a historian of Britain. He wrote his books on the empire and on imperialism, and most of our lectures were about British history, because he had access to the sources. And I think that is important. It was from being faithful to his professional principles that he became a British historian rather than anything else.
I think that will be it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Hedva.
I'm waiting for the answer.
What was the question? I forgot the question.
Why was there so much enthusiasm in the 1950s?
Oh, why? Well, that was the general mood in Germany. Just part of a Wiedergutmachung in a different sense. But it is very, very broad in academic circles. We have numerous examples of leading scholars who write to their pre-war colleagues at the Hebrew University that they have been approached by colleagues to join this effort, to join a friends organization. We have it in many places. And what is your advice? One such approach was to Professor Aksin, but Professor Aksin was not, Benjamin Aksin was not the right person to ask. He belonged to the party which threw stones at the parliament when the parliament approved this reparation agreement. So his advice was not the right one. But there were many others. Yeah, it's very broad. And just to, you talked about chemists or nuclear physicists. The main player on the Israeli side was Amos de Shalit, and he was a nuclear physicist. Okay, never mind.
Is there any other question? Any other question, Dorothy?
A very short question.
Yes, please.
Just came up, is there any evidence? Oh, sorry. Is there any evidence of correspondence between German scientists or friends of the university and professors at the Hebrew University asking for letters in support of their denazification processes?
There may be, but I did not find any such letter in our archives.
We are now here for 2 hours, and I think that we have to bring that session to a close. Only one last argument concerning, I think that Hanoch Gutfreund mentioned that year, and that might become a pivotal year concerning the research, and that is the year of 1957. 1957. And those who are familiar with European history might know that that was the year of the so-called Rome Treaties, which means the establishment of the European Economic Community. Everybody knows about it, everybody would accept it. But there was another treaty as well, and that was the Euratom Treaty. That was the European cooperation in nuclear physics and in nuclear energy. And the first who really started to lobby and to approach German scientists and let's say, institutions were Israeli German physicists, especially nuclear physicists, especially in theoretical physicists, isn't it? That's the case. And that happened in 1957. And it became a very important year, which only later on it became obvious in the late 50s and 59 what it meant when Otto Hahn came to visit Israel in the Weizmann Institute, opening up the German-Israeli scientific relations. Thank you for closing the session.